Hey all, here are OS Reviews. Prior to the popularity of digital cameras and eventually smartphone photography as we know it today, there were instant cameras. They were invented by Polaroid and became a pop culture phenomenon in the 1970s. Pricing was considered accessible, and the idea of being able to instantly print out your image, share it with friends and family, was really what made them so popular back in a day and age where the internet wasn't available, so we couldn't really preserve photos and videos digitally or share them on social media. So these days, instant film cameras, although still available, have been relegated to more of a novelty, although models from companies like Fujifilm, Kodak, as well as Polaroid definitely still exist. Today we're taking a look at one such example, which actually isn't the newest on the market anymore, being released in late 2014, but what makes it interesting is it actually has an Android operating system, so it is a smart camera of sorts, and I rediscovered this model after flipping through a Polaroid historical book that covers some of their different releases through the years, getting to more recent times. We have models like the iZone that were popular briefly in the 2000s, and then of course their instant printers as well before landing on that Socialmatic, which features a 14 megapixel primary lens and a 2 megapixel selfie camera as well, featuring Wi-Fi and Bluetooth like most Android devices, and prints in the standard 2x3-inch smudge-proof, water-resistant zinc paper, which is a pretty interesting type of thermally activated paper that contains liquid crystals, and once it's been heated up by the camera, it will produce the images and colors that we see. And that's why, like other thermal cameras, it doesn't actually contain an ink cartridge inside and allows the printer and camera itself to be pretty slim, since all the ink, so to speak, is already contained in the paper itself. This Socialmatic camera was also quite unique in terms of its form factor, being a perfect square on the front that resembled the old Instagram logo. And when this model first debuted, it sold at $300, which was also quite expensive for what it is, though perhaps because it never really took off, they have been often discounted and currently can be found for as low as $40 to $50 a pop when shopping around. Prints themselves being 2x3, they're fine for a simple little sticky note that you can share with friends and family to hang onto in a world that is increasingly digital, but ultimately it's still not going to be quite as large as a standard sized print, so keep that in mind. Unfortunately, Polaroid's rechargeable batteries didn't have the best quality, so they tended to degrade quickly over time, and if you're picking up a used unit, then there's a chance that it no longer holds a full charge, unless you're purchasing a new unit or swap out the battery yourself. So just a few things to keep in mind, which may add a little bit to the cost, but nonetheless, in the box here we have, of course, the Socialmatic camera itself that we'll take a closer look at, and in the bottom here, there's also a quick user guide along with 10 zinc papers pre-included. In the bottom here, there's also going to be the charger as well as some different travel adapter tips depending on your country or region. Although one thing to note is that the adapter is using a barrel plug as opposed to something like micro USB or USB Type-C. Anyways, coming back to the design, it definitely is very interesting looking. And I do kind of wish there would be some type of magnetic cover for the lens to protect it when not in use, but unfortunately that's not quite the case here. Nonetheless, very clean looking. There's just a speaker and microphone in the front, which can capture up to 720p video, though obviously the most practical use case of an instant camera is to shoot still photos with. There's also kind of a quirky monochrome black and white screen on the front, capable of showing some limited emojis, barcode information when you're interacting with the photos, and on the very top there's just simply a power key along with the shutter key, which is also a one-press key, so if you really wanted to focus on your shots, you would have to tap on the touchscreen portion, which was a little bit of a shame, but it is what it is. Now on the right-hand spine, there's access to the slot where the paper will come out of, and there's also a key that you can tap on to open up the back and insert the zinc prints. So this is the printer compartment, and otherwise the screen itself again folds downwards. We have a 4.5-inch panel. The very bottom of the camera also doesn't contain a standard tripod mount or thread, so that's also a little unfortunate. You have to just pop it onto a table, although it does stand upright because it's perfectly square, but it's just something to keep in mind. And then on the left-hand side, there is access to a micro USB port just for data transfer, and there is 4 gigs of built-in storage, but you can further expand that up to 32 gigabytes with a external micro SD card and also the charger port. along with a lanyard strap. Now just as a quick size comparison, here it is next to a more standard point-and-shoot camera from its time. So you can tell how this thing is just going to be a lot larger because of this whole kind of Instagram or logo-inspired look. Definitely catches your attention as kind of a conversation starter, but for sure not quite as practical in terms of gripping it. Now, another quick size comparison with one of Polaroid's instant printers. It shares similar design traits, including that classic Polaroid kind of rainbow stripe on the very top, but you can also tell how their Bluetooth mini printers are going to be a lot more compact as well. And to be completely honest, I will say up front that these models are probably more practical at the end of the day because you're able to connect it to any smartphone, even if you upgrade your phone, and the camera's quality can improve. For instance, going to a newer generation iPhone or Pixel versus on the camera version, you are stuck with the quality that the camera here will produce unless you somehow manually offload the photos from your phone onto an SD card and then pop the SD card into the camera here to print out. Moving into the software situation, since it is running on Android, one of the other slight cons is it does take a few seconds for the system to boot up. And that's kind of a similar issue as with the Light L16, which is if you are wanting to really quickly snap a shot, it's just not quite as fast as compared to a conventional point-and-shoot system or a device with a quick boot function. But it is what it is. At the very least, once you get into the system, it is a very clean version of Android 4.4 KitKat. Obviously, this is many generations out of date, but it still is usable, I'd say, for just some basic navigating around, using it as a camera, and sharing your shots into Google Photos, Dropbox, or let's say Facebook or Twitter. So those basic tasks will certainly work. With that being said, the touchscreen on this is unfortunately not the highest quality. It certainly works, but it doesn't have the widest viewing angles, so it is a T-in panel, and because it's not fully laminated, the glass and the LCD underneath does tend to cast a little bit more glares than what we would typically want to see on a camera. When you are opening up the viewfinder, at least it is a pretty large display. And aside from Bluetooth, there is built-in GPS as well, so you are able to geotag your photos, which is kind of neat. Now, in terms of additional software functions, you can go over to, interestingly, a CPU selector. You can choose between performance, a power-saving mode, as well as an on-demand mode, which is basically in between those two settings. And in terms of processing power, don't expect anything spectacular, though that is partly a product of its time. Being a slightly older system, it has 1 GB of RAM and using a quad-core MediaTek processor as well. Otherwise, there are virtual keys at the very bottom that can take you back home, open up multitasking, as well as change the volume controls. It really is behaving like a mini tablet of sorts. So from here, let's just jump into the camera app, which does have that proprietary Polaroid Socialmatic logo to it. We can either go into a social axis for sharing your photos, or launch into the gallery, or go into the camera mode just by tapping on that key there. Flash properties, as well as more advanced controls for white balance, ISO, and even HDR can be toggled with on the system, as well as transitioning into that front-facing camera for selfies there at a click, but you can tell that it is, for sure, not the fastest unit in the world. Click on the shutter key, and there we are. It will take kind of a split-second delay, though it does have that kind of quirky sound effect. So they are leaning hard into nostalgia and a little bit more of that novelty factor with the built-in speakers there on the front. Afterwards, though, you are able to very quickly edit this shot. This includes a enhance functionality, which will make the image supposedly a little bit sharper, as well as illuminate slightly darker backgrounds, even try to fix some of the color properties automatically. Additional filters over the image just to make it look more weathered and old-fashioned. Again, it does take a few seconds for things to process, which is not too surprising considering the much lower end hardware that we have running the show, but again, still kind of fun to play around with, at least in the editor mode. Change the focus slightly. It's not going to be quite the same as real bokeh on more modern smartphones that have a secondary sensor for detecting depth. On here is all done digitally, but you can simulate some of that effect, like this vertical strip, which is in focus, everything else which is out of focus, saturation, warmth, sharpness, splash, even draw and doodle over the image using all of these different colors. And that is in addition to text messages that you can also write on here, and that will pull up the QWERTY keyboard, which we can also rearrange the position of this particular text box, the size, and even the orientation a little bit more flexibly as well until we are satisfied. And since it is at least a multi-touch display, we can pinch in and out. Final properties here include red eye reduction if there is a face that is detected, as well as whitening the skin, so some beauty effects can also be played around with. We can then proceed to the next page, which will give us a shot of how many copies of the image we want to print out. Afterwards, it will take up to 30 seconds to print out the image. It's going to kind of heat up the paper that will then start to come out there from the side, and you'll see also a print logo on the display there on the front. And it's instantly dry, so you can't touch it. It's not going to stain your fingers. It's also going to be, again, water resistant, smudge resistant, and what's cool about these zinc papers is they're also sticky on the back. To attach it onto anything that you want, whether it's going to be your fridge, some type of folder, piece of paper to preserve the photo, and adding a little bit more versatility. Colors do tend to be just a little bit more muted compared to if you're looking at a conventional ink cartridge-based printer, as well as the digital copy itself on the display of the camera is also just a little bit sharper. But you can still preserve the memory, and the image itself does have kind of that retro throwback vibe to it, which is kind of cool. Now, aside from the Polaroid camera app, you can also go into a standard Android version of the camera app, or the gallery in fact, to also take images. You can even change things like the resolution, the picture size more easily on this app if you want to get more of a widescreen image, which isn't possible, ironically enough, in Polaroid's own version of their camera app. But afterwards, you can view it in your gallery and still look back at images in addition to print them out just by tapping on the top and then going over to print, plus share it to social media or to other devices using Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. Granted, you do have to be in very well-lit conditions since there is no optical image stabilization, and the sensor size on this thing is going to be pretty small. So once the light starts getting dimmer, there is no night mode, and image quality is going to deteriorate pretty quickly. And additional apps that I have here include a screen capture tool, as well as a voice recorder, which all function as you would expect, plus a basic YouTube viewer can still function as well, plus a handful of standard Android utility tools like a clock, as well as calculator that you can find on here, even if it's a pretty weird use case for a camera at the very least. The animation on Android KitKat for turning the display on and off is also kind of cool in terms of it flashes down to a single line. And by the way, this thing does have an accelerometer, which means you can rotate the screen 360 degrees. So you can use it in a portrait orientation, really resembling that of a smartphone if you desired, plus a simple music player app and Google Maps, since this thing again does have built-in GPS. In fact, Hangouts is even pre-installed because it does have that front-facing selfie camera. And of course, like on any other Android device, there is support for all the widgets that you could possibly want, and you can drag them onto this homepage. Taking also a quick peek at the web browser, you can indeed still use it for some very light purposes, although it is going to be kind of a slow experience compared to, again, more powerful modern-day hardware that we have available. Here's also just a quick demo of it playing back a YouTube video with the built-in speakers on the camera. So takeaway is it actually doesn't sound too bad for a camera, that is, even if it is a bit silly to use this for watching videos at the end of the day as a camera, but it does indeed function. So that's more or less it as far as our revisited look back at the very quirky Polaroid Socialmatic Instant Camera. It's still an interesting camera for what it is and very cute conversation starter. Here in 2023, I wouldn't necessarily recommend picking one up, but it's always interesting looking back at these kind of unique cameras in general, and also curious to see whether these smart cameras running on Android might make a resurgence someday. You can check out additional details if you're interested in the links down below. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the quirky Polaroid Socialmatic.